If you're vulnerable to psychic damage from roguish language, stay away from these gibbering mouths. But if you intend on listening to this podcast about enriching your fantastical group hallucinations, you're too far gone already.
We are the brothers, both DMs and players. I'm the one that enjoys a good strawberry rhubarb crumble pie, Travis.
And I'm the one that would eat any dessert, even if it was a cake, a pie, and a flan, blended together into some kind of a nasty dessert soup, Jordan.
And you probably have done that.
Well, I haven't done that specifically, but I have microwaved a whole batch of cookie dough. It made me real sick. But I would do it.
As it should. Welcome to the Hook and Chance podcast.
Cleaning your dingy dungeon with the veneer of cube slime for incredible games.
If that wasn't a hint as to what we're talking about today, well, we're talking about monsters.
Our first monster episode, the big square slimy one, Gelatinous Cube.
Yeah, going back to some of the original monsters of D&D, we kind of hoped that we wouldn't dive into a rabbit hole of research that we usually do. We thought, okay, Gelatinous Cube, that's simple.
It doesn't have all the lore of dragons or vampires or anything like that. It's just a cube of goo. How hard can it be?
We still found an unreal amount of information that related back to gelatinous cubes. So we're going to try and cover all of that today. A couple of the interesting things that we came across, there is a lot more to digest with gelatinous cubes because, like gigantic single-celled amoebas, the real world is full of lots of examples of these wild creatures that have just grown to epic proportions. In one instance in Texas, in a cornfield in Texas, they found a 40-foot wide colony of spores that was all working together to survive and live.
Just a mass of goo.
Yeah, and it was sitting underneath the vegetation there. And it was one of the largest spore colonies ever found. And then it was destroyed by rain the very next day.
So that's the largest found, but that means that anyone could have in their backyard a big gelatinous cube under the surface, just waiting?
Well, pretty much, because, yeah, like you said, that's the ones that we know about. There was another example of a massive single-celled amoeba that grew to 1 inch across inside the fish tank of Manfred Schliewa, who was a cell biologist at Berkeley.
So there's probably massive ones in the ocean or something.
Oh yeah, there's weird shit that we do not know about.
And I do need to ask, did a wizard make it? Or did Jublex, the demon lord of goo, make it?
Yeah, it could be a gift from Jublex.
Yeah. I always forget what he's the demon lord of. Oozes, I guess.
Snot. He's the demon lord of snot.
All right, so today we're going to actually go through some of our segments instead of just freewheeling it. And our first one's going to be Archives of the Ancients, where we're going to theorize some properties of gelatinous cubes from the real world.
And then we're going to hop into Strategy Stateroom and look at how they can be utilized in-game and really look at, how DMs and players can kind of approach them.
And then we go into Lamash 2's Breeding Pit, where we come up with a couple of cool mechanics for gelatinous cubes that you can add. It'll really throw your players for a loop if you're a DM, and just mess with you if you're a player.
Cool. Let's get into it.
This is the Archives of the Ancients, where knowledge is unearthed to add wild insights to our world.
Okay, so to kind of level set everyone with what the gelatinous cube is, maybe you're unfamiliar with it.
So it's a 10-foot by 10-foot cube of translucent ooze. It's thought to be mindless, and it was created by Gary Gygax in 1977 with the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, its original intention was basically is just kind of a semi-sentient, spewy, sludgy trap
that players would walk into and get acid melted away into the dark night.
Or saved.
Yeah.
One of the two.
If you consider some of the details of that, it's a huge mass of liquidy jello. So that's about 50,000 pounds.
Yeah, it's absolutely monstrously heavy. it's always depicted as having kind of a green tinge in a lot of art, which I think is a little bit misleading.
Yeah.
And I think that's why players maybe aren't terrified of it, because it's really hard to spot.
Yeah, and it's really hard to draw an invisible cube.
Also true.
So I get why the art does that, but yeah, it's a DC 15 perception check to spot, which is pretty high above the average person.
Yeah, so you might see like a glisten if you're really, really perceptive.
Mm-hmm. Like I was saying, it's mindless, and it's got an intelligence of 1, which is the lowest you can have.
Like our Uncle Gerald.
Did some weird things. But this is even lower than that. This is like nothing but the desire to consume.
Sure.
And it doesn't do that intelligently.
There is a glimmer of intelligence because even though jellyfish don't have brains, and this is true, jellyfish that do not have brains have been studied to migrate. Now, tell me, how does something without a brain have a migration pattern?
Some kind of jelly instinct patterns in there? Some kind of wires that...
Well, kind of, sort of, actually. There is microscopic algae inside the cells of jellyfish that want to follow the sun. So, yeah, the jellyfish would actually... There's a specific lake in Palau in the Pacific that these jellyfish have been studied and recorded to actually follow migration patterns.
Well, that's some weird stuff. That's like plant level intelligence, though. Because like plants bend towards the sun, too.
Fine.
That doesn't defend their intelligence at all. But that is pretty cool. So you could play them as having some kind of a migration or instinct within the dungeons that they roam.
Absolutely. Yeah, you could play them as more or less being intelligent enough to not consume their own kind of food source. So they might move throughout a dungeon and allow certain like moss and lichen, which it might consume off the walls and the floors, to regrow. So in that sense, it might have a pattern that it would actually crawl through a dungeon.
Yeah. And so if you actually do come across one of these bad boys and you get sucked in or you get into a fight, what I find kind of challenging sometimes is describing the battle of a massive block of Jell-O. Which is why my little group and I once made a film where we did just that.
You fought a brick of Jell-O?
Yeah.
Of course you would.
Picked up a massive pot of Jell-O and took our swords. It was part of the plot. Of course. Factored in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, it's just as anticlimactic in real life to hack a sword through Jell-O. It really doesn't fight back much.
Okay, so where is all this leading?
Well, it's leading to the fact that you got to put a little more thought into how to describe a fight with a gelatinous cube.
So, like, different types of attacks.
Yeah. So if you got the bludgeoning, I mean, that's not too difficult because you can just describe the smashing apart of the liquid as it splashes on the walls and kind of burns into some things.
Might have a bit of a ripple.
Yeah.
I would see this kind of moving more or less like a non-Newtonian fluid. Like they've filled big-ass tubs full of non-Newtonian fluids and people are able to run across. So in that sense, you could make an impact with it and it would be kind of hard, but it would be so effortless to swallow you because if you don't hit it with any kind of force, then you just kind of sink into it like it was water.
Okay, so when force hits it kind of hardens up. So you could almost be cracking it in that case if you hit it hard enough.
I don't think that's necessarily possible with a non-Newtonian fluid, but darn near. Like, it reacts really, really hard. It would react like you were hitting something solid.
Yeah.
But as soon as you, say, take a slash at it with a sword, then all of a sudden it carves through kind of like Jell-O.
Yeah. And I guess with a slashing weapon like that, when you cut through Jell-O with like a spoon or something, it kind of creates that visible cut line. Like you can see where the spoon went through it.
Yeah.
Just because it like ripples the light.
Yeah.
So yeah, you could have all kinds of slash marks through it. You would see those as you were...
And it might become a little bit more visible than it was before.
Yeah.
If you had hacked at it a couple of times.
So then if you do get away from it, then you'll see it a little easier the next time you come across it, maybe.
And we did do a little bit of research to try to figure out any kind of experiments that have been done on just anything that we could rely on. And we did come across a lot of horrible YouTube experiments. Somebody makes a cube of Jell-O and then tries to light it with a lighter. And the video is 5 minutes long, but it ends with inconclusive. It's like,
did nothing.
Good.
Great. I'm glad I spent my time on that.
Yeah, I just wasted 5 minutes. I don't know, like lightning might actually do some kind of damage, kind of like the way that lightning might rip through a tree and it has those weird little tendrils and it might have an effect on its ability to regenerate, things
Kinda
like that.
Splits it apart in certain spots.
Yeah, or
That'd
makes
be
a
cool.
weak point.
And then, of course, when it's attacking you, it's got all kinds of good stuff that we found.
Oh, absolutely. First, you have the fact that it is caustic, like it burns and digests living or organic material. So, this is skin, leather, hair, eyes, teeth.
Not my teeth. I mean, slowly on the teeth. Right?
Yeah, it's digested everything of the last adventure except for its nice choppers just in the
I feel
front.
like a set of dentures you pull out. Great. Yeah, but some of the effects of acid that you could describe in combat are like its dehydrating effects. So if it came into contact with your skin through splashing, it would dry it out. Or if you were engulfed by it, then you'd come out of there just like really dried out. You'd be really thirsty. Your skin would be cracking.
Oh.
It'd be kind of awful.
Oh, yeah. That would be awful.
Of course, you got the redness and irritation as well, where
Of
it
an
starts to
acid
touch
burn.
your skin. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just like really itchy.
Oh, yeah. I can't imagine coming out of a gelatinous cube. And I think you can definitely get into the role playing of that as a player because, yeah, if you get engulfed, you're coming out of there burnt, like you said, dehydrated. You're probably not ready for more adventures. Like that's an excuse to take some downtime to go like, I need a rest.
And then you probably got a pretty massive headache too, which is something that isn't touched on very much. And if you've been dried out that thoroughly,
oh yeah,
your head's probably banging.
Yeah, Jesus. You'd have all kinds of blisters and like blackness of skin.
Ooh, if you want to get kind of nastier with it.
Grosser, yeah.
And then I think it'd be really cool to describe being engulfed by it. So the first round that you step into it, you start to feel maybe really icy cold at first, which is almost that foreshadowing of like something bad's coming.
The pendulum swing.
Yeah. And then the second round, you start to heat up, and every subsequent round, it just gets hotter and hotter, and your skin's starting to
that'd be the
blister.
worst.
And oh, yeah.
I mean, you only have 3 or 4 rounds in you anyways, because that thing does some serious damage when you've been engulfed.
Yeah, yeah. And then don't forget, if you do get a party member out and you're trying to do some first aid, that if you're not actually good at first aid as a character, you're probably going to splash some water on there, and that just makes it burn worse if it's acid.
Learned that day 1 in science class. Don't pour water on acid.
Did you do it? Did you dip your hand in there?
Speaking of being engulfed, though, one of the other cool things from real world is the pseudopodia, or the...
Getting fancy on me.
Oh, yeah. So it has the trait of pseudopod. And what that actually means is that it can create temporary arms or tendrils
that it uses
out of its body
to attack.
Yeah, and this actually comes from cellular biology. So certain cells are able to create tendrils by just pushing their material around and creating a small arm.
I wish I could do that. I got a lot of extra mass that I could just push out. Make another arm.
But yeah, it makes kind of temporary soupy arms. So I would see that as how it would definitely engulf you. I have a bit of a gripe with its actual attack. The gelatinous cube has an attack, but the only way that I can really describe it would be as like a tendril slap across the face.
Yeah, it just kind of like smacks at enemies, which doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I don't see the gelatinous cube being like, this is going to be my best approach, is just to slap people with my soup arms.
Again, they're not very bright, but go on.
Yeah, I would see it as much more using the tendrils to kind of engulf and help pull in material into its form.
Yeah.
So it just kind of wraps a whole bunch of arms around you as it pulls you in.
So you could have it do a grapple check instead of like a typical attack if you wanted.
Yeah.
It would make more sense for the creature.
Yeah, that would make way more sense.
And it'd be kind of like one of those sticky hands you get in the machines that you buy toys from. That's what we're talking about.
The snot hands that like stretch and stick to stuff?
Yeah.
Ah.
I used to slap you in the face with those.
Yes. I do remember, until they got covered in dirt and they no longer grabbed anything anymore. So
there's our basic science for you.
Well, what about movement? How do they move?
Well, they're pretty slow in as far as how fast a character can typically move. Most characters in 5th edition have about 30 feet of movement, and these guys move 15 feet.
So most characters can stay ahead of them.
Yeah, and that's kind of like an out that you have in your mind when you're fighting one of these guys, is that you can probably run away if everything goes bad.
Keeping in mind, though, that if 6 seconds is a typical round, and it can move 15 feet in a typical round, and if it uses its action as well, then...
Double moves to 30 feet.
Double moves to 30 feet in 6 seconds. That thing is motoring.
Yeah, that's
pretty, got a good slide.
Pretty fast for a terrifying wall of slime. I'm not into that.
So Coventry University students actually designed a concept car called 2096. It was a really wild looking thing. It had something that they coined slug drive, which wasn't necessarily the sexiest term of locomotion for
very futuristic
concept car. But the way that it actually worked was it had thousands of tiny little pads on the bottom that basically made a wheel a non-thing, and it would just basically move these thousands of little pads many times in a second forward. So it would just kind of scooch them forward. So very similar to the way that a slug moves, except that it would be totally imperceptible. It would essentially just slide across the ground. And if the technology was sufficient enough, they theorized that these pads would help the car move at speeds of like 300 to 400 kilometers an hour.
Jeez.
So even though it's moving an inch at a time, it's moving an inch at a time really fast.
Yeah, that'd be pretty wild to see. So yeah, you're saying that this cube would just kind of glide across the floor in a creepy... Like, what's it actually doing to move? I don't know.
Yeah, like, I was trying to wrap my brain around how I would picture something like this move. And not really like a snake, and it probably wouldn't do... I mean, it could do like a wave.
Yeah,
and
like
you were talking
see
about
the bottom wave.
Yeah. You're talking about the hands. It might kind of like push itself against, or use its little soupy arms to kind of like crawl forward.
Yeah, I think that could be... You could either go subtle with it, or you could go kind of over the top with it. And I imagine it kind of like slapping out against both walls of the tunnel and then using those to just drag itself forward.
See, and that's where the slug drive came back in, because I loved the idea of this thing just moving. You couldn't see it move.
Yeah.
But it was, kind of undulating on the bottom 1,000 times across its massive form on the very bottom and just pushing itself through. But the adventurers would not, you couldn't even look that closely to see how it was actually pushing itself and propelling itself
you'd
forward.
still have that difficult to see cube even when it's moving.
Yeah.
Which is pretty terrifying, yeah.
Yeah, it would just be a moving wall of invisibility. It's just wild.
Whew.
All right, well, I think we've kind of exhausted our research for this Archives of the Ancients.
So let's move on to the strategy stateroom, where we're going to talk about how to use it.
This is the strategy stateroom, where inventive and cunning tactics are crafted for when they're needed most.
All right, so gelatinous cubes were always kind of just intended to be traps. Like, they weren't necessarily meant to be a monster that would hunt or anything like that. They were just there.
Yeah, and there's some classic ways to use it that work really well. There's like we're kind of talking about, the invisible wall in the hallway. You just walk into it. That's kind of how it was envisioned. And then you've got a party member that's just hovering, suffocating in acid.
Yeah.
And you've also got the pit trap. A lot of people go that route, which is also, again, pretty awesome. Instead of spikes, you've got them dropping into an acid cube and you're trying to pull them out and they're turning into a
Doubly
skeleton.
sucks.
Yeah. And then I've even seen on Reddit a few times people suggesting a ceiling trap so it drops on you instead, which you're just not really expecting as a adventurer walking down the hallway. But we wanted to get into some little bit more out there ways to use it as well, in different ways than a trap sense too.
So very similarly to how we actually run our games, you went a little bit more high fantasy and what weird and wild with it.
Yeah.
And I took mine in more of a gritty, realistic bent, more towards something horror-esque.
A little more creepy, a little more suspenseful.
Yeah. So we're going to start, you're going to take us through a couple of the different ways that you thought to use a gelatinous cube.
Yeah, so the first one, I was just running my head through a high-paced encounter instead of a slow-paced trap.
Okay.
So
this is like the Fast and Furious gelatinous cube version.
very much so.
Okay, lay it on me.
You can set it up however you want in your game, and this absolutely won't make sense probably in anyone's game. But for my scenario, you need some kind of a gelatinous cube production facility on the top of a mountain.
Who funded this project?
I'm not sure. Either the Demon Lord himself or maybe a group of wizards. You know how they do. They're always cooking up grand plans to end the world.
Sure.
So in some kind of a production facility heist or takedown, or maybe you're just underneath it in the caves in the mountain, you come out onto the top of the mountainside and there's an explosion from whatever, and all the oozes start rolling down the hill like giant...
You've got a gelatinous cube avalanche.
Yeah, gelatinous cube snowballs, avalanche that are just plummeting down the mountainside. So you got to find some kind of a sled to use as the party, either a door to the mountain or a tree or a satellite dish.
When you have a wall of gelatinous cubes that are tumbling down a mountain, how are they any different than, say, a rock slide?
Well, they're acid, so they explode into things and they create a giant splash of acid. And they're also gaining so much momentum because they're just picking stuff up on the roll down. And so you've got like tree splinters, explosions as well, and stuff like that. So it's a pretty chaotic scene.
Sure.
And so the party rules that you could have when you're on the sled, you could have someone piloting the sled. You could have somebody trying to attack the cubes that are rolling down to explode them before they get too close. You could have someone destroying obstacles ahead of you. Someone trying to pick up speed with the sled to stay ahead.
So you would run this as like a chase scene.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And then, of course, with any good chase scene, you got to have obstacles for them to get around, which could be things like fallen trees, ravines that you're trying to jump over, cliff faces that you're just coming down hard off of. You could have herds of animals like deer, or maybe even, an owlbear that he's surprised and is running down in front of you. I think it could be a lot of fun.
I'm all tapped out. That was an adrenaline rush.
Good. We didn't even get into it.
All right. What else you got?
All right. So then I've got an environment
Okay.
that I think could be cool for some travel across, which would be a gelatinous lake. So you're in kind of a magical swampy area in which the lake is full of a gelatinous mass that's not necessarily individual cubes, but it's just full of whatever material they're made of.
Okay.
And it came from maybe the environment, or maybe there's something on the bottom spawning it. Might be a mystery, but you've either got to get across it or to an island on the middle for whatever, your objective is. And to cross it, I think most dramatically, of course, you need a small boat of some sort, either a raft or a canoe that's, pretty easy to tip and fall in, which is super awful to think about.
You better make that boat metal because...
Well, yeah, or it's slowly corroding, and that's even scarier.
Yeah.
And I think it could be really interesting to have the gelatinous material know that you're there. So maybe it's either slowly attacking you, occasionally one of those arms come up, or in the distance you just see kind of like swells and waves that come out of nowhere. Because I don't understand how this works.
Yeah, it's not like it's a windy day and it's creating waves. It's just unnaturally moving.
Yeah, and that might
And
be kind
reacting
of
to
one
your
of the
presence.
things you have to watch out for and like roll dexterity checks to not fall out of your boat. And of course, it's still invisible. It's still clear. And there might be remnants of other people that have tried to cross this lake at the bottom of the lake. So that's where you've got some treasure or some armor. And it's really tempting to go get it, but that's hard to...
Get your Tinker Gnome to start making a diving bell or something like that so you can get down to that treasure at the bottom.
Acid proof. So yeah, I think that could provide some interesting temptations.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Good.
And then my most outrageous idea,
Oh boy.
I'll keep this short, but if you came across a community that used gelatinous cubes as a defensive mechanism.
All right.
So if you had a defensive wall of gelatinous cubes that was 1 or 2 cubes high, and 1 cube high makes sense, or a moat. A moat makes the most sense. 1 cube high is getting weird. 2 cubes high is like, well, how did they do that?
And you've got gelatinous cubes balancing on one another.
Yeah. And the reason they are is because you've got street lights around the perimeter of your community.
Okay.
Then instead of lights, they're hanging rats
As the bait.
tempt the cubes to go straight up.
The carrot on the stick approach to defensive walls.
And I saw this approach taken a few times on Reddit when people were asking what kind of a creature could live inside of a gelatinous cube. And what came up was clay golems, because they don't not only immune to acid, but they actually gain health from acid. So if your community leaders or wizards had created a couple of these bad boys to keep things in check and to patrol the walls, they could patrol directly through the cubes.
They could just waltz on through.
Yeah. And I mean, if they take any damage, they just run back to the cube.
Wow.
That's kind of a cool protector.
That is very cool. Yeah, that's some high fantasy juice.
I mean, imagine if you had an army that just tried to run straight at the town.
There you go.
They just run into a massive
if you had some
cube.
means of controlling a gelatinous cube, you could have like a forward-moving defensive wall.
Yeah, there's that too.
There you go. Okay, well, I took like I said, a little bit more of a gritty, realistic horror approach. So the first one that I kind of came up with was really just some ideas on making the cube more terrifying and kind of foreboding and setting the scene before somebody would encounter a gelatinous cube, say in a dungeon. The first one being, so you're walking through a dungeon and the druid rolls a nature check to notice that this particular hallway is devoid of any moss or lichen like the rest of the place. It's kind of dry, like we were talking about. It's sapped all of the moisture out of this particular hallway.
Okay, so the air is actually drying out as well.
Exactly.
It's kind of got that like alcohol dryness to it.
Yeah, because the gelatinous cube would just simply move down the hallway and it would eat all of that up and let it grow over the course of the next however long.
Yeah.
So now you've got an unnaturally clean hallway that's kind of throwing people off. Why is this dark, dank dungeon so immaculately clean? And then they come across, well, any inorganic material is not being consumed. So what would count as inorganic material? Basically just metal, because all of your leather boots are being consumed, your belts, your clothes, because it's all cotton.
Yeah.
So cotton and linen are being completely consumed. So there is nothing left of an adventurer that comes across a gelatinous cube unless they were carrying, say, a dagger and maybe some belt buckles. So if your characters come across a single belt buckle sitting in the middle of the, and they roll a high perception to just notice that one single belt buckle. What is this? That's weird.
Yeah.
And then they come across 1 or 2 more in a perfectly clean hallway. And it's like that breadcrumb trail that is just
metal bits that aren't super obvious. Like weapons are fine, but I think that's a bigger clue than something more subtle like belt buckles or even like
just, why are they there?
Gold teeth, like something
gold
like that.
fillings. Yeah. I think, as soon as players come across that single dagger just laying in the middle of the hallway, that's going to really start tipping them off, and they're going to be on edge.
Yeah.
Okay, so my second idea, you've got players wandering through a now clean dungeon. And if that wasn't already kind of tipping them off that something odd is going on, they roll a perception check, and the DM says, yeah, you notice there's a figure standing in the hallway. You roll let's say a 13 or 14 is the highest to actually spot something. And down in the center of the hallway, you see a zombie standing in armor.
Okay, so it's above the kind of the typical, sometimes you see a suit of armor or a weapon in the actual gelatinous cube itself.
Sure, yeah, as like treasure bait kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is that you've got a sword floating in midair. So it's pretty clear what's going on there.
Yeah.
I mean, a clever player is going to figure that out. However, if their perception is high enough that they notice this zombie standing in a suit of armor, that's going to throw them off a little bit. So they might sit there and try to figure out how to approach, and oh my god, this thing's down there. Why isn't it moving? What do we do? Should we try to approach? It's still not moving. We threw something out in the hallway to attract it, to distract it, and it's still not moving. What's going on? And now we're going to try to approach it. And as they get closer, maybe not before it's too late, they notice that it's not in fact a zombie, it's an adventurer being digested.
Yeah.
So that might get the players close enough without realizing that it's actually a gelatinous cube, but it's just close enough to attack.
Yeah. That's a good way to build some tension and
I think just throwing people off the trail.
Yeah.
Like, it's just suspended there because anything that the gelatinous cube swallows moves with it. So, yeah, it might have come across a swarm of rats that now look like zombie rats because they're slowly being digested.
yeah, but they're not moving.
And then the final one that I had was, what about a community of weirdos that feed a gelatinous cube? I'm kind of going more towards Lovecraftian, Shadow over Innsmouth, kind of the entire town is in on it, and they worship a gelatinous cube in a pit.
Yeah.
Very similar to a god.
That's pretty cool.
And so they're being really nice to your party for weeks while you've been staying in town. Everyone's been super nice, offering you a lot of food. They might just be fattening you up to throw you into the pit.
Yeah, nothing like a creepy community that's a little too nice.
And actually, we had one of the folks on our Discord, Will, talk about how you could put a gelatinous cube in a pit, but it might escape eventually because after you fed it for, say, years, this thing would eventually stop digesting all of the metal bits that you fed it, and it might actually be able to stand on all of that and get its way
Just
out.
kind of slowly lift itself out of the pit.
Yeah.
Nice.
They're a doomsday cult. They know that the cube is going to get out one day.
The end is nigh.
So yeah, thanks Will for the idea there. Yeah, I kind of just like this idea that the entire town was into it. Or what about a group of warriors that very similar to the way orcs worship Grumsh and pluck out one of their eyes. They were so warrior focused, so offensive focused that they would allow, say, one of their defensive limbs, like their left arm, to be consumed by a gelatinous cube cleanly.
Or even either consumed fully or even just like marked by it.
Yeah.
So like you dip your arm in. It's kind of like the Fight Club thing, but with your whole arm.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the acid burn that he does in Fight Club.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all gross and mangled and
yeah. I also like the idea in that community. It wouldn't even need to be a gelatinous cube in a pit. It might be cool to have somebody as like the gelatinous cube handler that you don't really know about, and they're kind of worshipped as a religious figure, and maybe they lure the gelatinous cube where they want it by just staying ahead of it a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just following them, but maybe it follows them right into your room, and the handler jumps right out the window, and then you've got a gelatinous cube in front of your bed.
Oh, to be woken up consumed by a gelatinous cube?
As it just like moves over your bed and your feet start tingling or something.
Jesus. No, thank you. All right. Well, if gelatinous cubes aren't terrifying enough, we've got some ideas in Lamashu's breeding pit on how to make them more dangerous. So let's go there.
All right.
This is Lamashtu's breeding pit, where the most vile and deadly of creatures are birthed and unleashed upon doomed adventurers.
All right, so the Gelatinous Cube has a lot of really interesting things that you can do with it already, but as we were getting our wheels turning, we came up with some traits that we think are really cool twists to add to it.
And these are kind of just meant to be tacked on to an already existing Gelatinous Cube. Like, they just make the Gelatinous Cube that much more dangerous and that much more unexpected. So maybe your players have encountered a Gelatinous Cube before, but now all of a sudden they're surprised by just this one additional trait that they're showing.
Yeah, you always got to ramp it up a bit. The characters don't know, but sometimes you got that player that's read the entire monster manual cover to cover.
Hi, Tyler.
So our first trait we called it momentum, and it came from that thought of how do you get 50,000 pounds of mass moving?
Very difficultly.
Yeah, so it'd probably start off pretty slow. So instead of just having the standard 15 feet of movement, this would make it so the first round of movement is 5 feet. And so as the party, you're thinking, okay, that's pretty slow. We're still fine.
Yeah, you're like a slow walking in front of it.
Yeah. And then the next round, it doubles to 10 feet of movement. And then the next round, it doubles to 20 feet. So now it's picking up some steam.
Bit faster,
and
yeah.
that's starting to get pretty awful. It's like, oh, shoot, we got to get out of the way of this thing.
Yeah.
And then it finally caps out, and it doubles one more time to 40 feet.
So just above the average run speed.
Yeah, so now you're having to sprint away from it. And again, it can use its action to move as well, which puts it at 80 feet of movement per turn, which that thing is just ripping down hallways now.
So to recap, every turn of unimpeded movement doubles the cube's speed to a maximum of 40 feet of movement per turn. So if I threw something in front of the Gelatinous Cube, that would slow it down and half its speed.
Yeah,
back down.
Yeah, I think it'd be cool if if an obstacle halved its speed down to 20 again, but then the next round it just picked right back up again. So it gives you a tiny bit of breathing room if you need it, but it's still right on your tail.
So kind of like the Juggernaut from X-Men. It's just as long as it's in a straight line and it's not being impeded in any way, it just rolls over everything.
Yeah, and maybe around corners, it like splashes into a corner and then reconfigures itself and starts heading down.
Yeah. So the second one, we were thinking about the way that certain animals are able to anesthetize and cause hallucinations, things like the brown recluse spider. Fun fact, there is actual research being done into the proteins within spider venom to help with pain relief.
Oh no.
Which is pretty wild.
So you're saying my doctor's going to start just throwing spiders on me?
Just dumps out a bag of spiders on me.
I don't want that, Doc.
This will help your toothache. No, but seriously, there's tons of proteins in there in spider venom. So what if the Gelatinous Cube worked something very similarly? So it's a trait called euphoric digestion. So when a creature comes into direct skin contact with a cube, it creates a sense of calmness and ease, which also counteracts any pain felt from its corrosive properties. When a creature is engulfed by the cube, the creature gains the stunned and charmed condition in addition to the rest of the restrained condition that it usually imposes.
Okay, stunned and charmed.
Stunned and charmed.
So charmed means you're persuaded to like this creature and you can't attack it.
You cannot make an action to attack it.
So if I wander in there, I'm just basking in it while my friends are maybe trying to get me out as they see my skin burning.
You're being burned, but you're smiling.
Yeah, I'm just like, this is really nice, everybody.
Yeah, so it attaches to those kind of pleasure centers of your brain, and it's taking over and it's making you feel good, even though it's digesting you.
Oh, yeah. That creates some tension.
And then the stunned property means that you're not going anywhere.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So also, you can't necessarily help your comrades get you out of the Gelatinous Cube.
Because you're busy trying to convince them to get in it.
More or less. I mean, you could technically talk. Yeah, with the stunned condition, you can
still talk.
speak.
Yeah.
but very poorly.
You might have to have your head poking out of the cube or something, because you are choking to death still.
You're just mouthing all's good, and you've got your thumb up.
Blowing bubbles. Doing flips.
Can you move that freely?
Yeah, probably not.
Okay, the final one is called Pocket Cube. So let's take us through that one.
Yeah, so we had some fun with this one because it creates an immediate tension. So once engulfed in the cube, the target disappears into a pocket dimension. And so for those viewing this, your party member just is gone.
You can still see through the creature to the other side, to the dungeon hallway beyond, but the person has disappeared entirely.
So now you're desperate to find out what happened to them. So that's happening on the outside. And inside the pocket dimension, it's kind of like that scene in a lot of movies where it's just like a gray, foggy, dark place you can't see the edges of.
Like Eleven's kind of nightmare world, her hypnosis world that she goes into in Stranger Things.
Oh, yeah.
There's like a foot of water on the bottom, and that's what's like acid eating you.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So yeah, if you've got acid touching your feet that's doing one acid damage per round, it kind of creates that tension. You got to get out of there.
It's pretty minimal, and it's meant to attack slowly.
But you can't just lay down and take a break. And as well as that, you've got other creatures that have wandered into this pocket dimension as well. And so you've got maybe some corroded rats or some... What do we have? We created a table so you could have a zombie in there, a giant rat, a goblin, a giant wolf spider, things like that.
The adventure that gets swallowed is still not out of combat. So combat's happening all at the same time. Your players on the outside are trying to figure out how to hack at this thing and get you out. And then on the flip side, you're fighting on the inside, trying to stay alive while you're being slowly digested and fighting the half-eaten animals that are still in the cube.
And you might get a particularly bold ally that runs in with you, and now you're both fighting, but then the people on the outside are still trying to take it down. And as soon as you kill the gelatinous cube from the outside, everything that was in this pocket dimension kind of just comes into
existence in this space.
Yeah.
That could certainly add a lot more
chaos.
Make
it interesting.
We are the bringers of chaos. So all of these new traits are going to be available on our Patreon. So you can just go ahead and download them. Patreon.com/hookandchance. Yeah, download the PDF of some of these new traits if you want a little reminder. We also have that table. It's just a D10, but you got a couple of different options there for creatures that you might encounter within the cube itself.
And that'll just about wrap up this episode. So thanks again to Will, who's a contributor on our Patreon, and he joined us in our Discord chat for this episode to give us some ideas.
Our Writers Room Discord, and that's where we discuss some of the contents of the episode as we're writing them.
And thanks to Tabletop Audio for the sound effects that you hear in all the segment breaks.
And you can follow us at Hook and Chance on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Discord, and Reddit. And, you can always... find us there, talk to us about what you like, talk to us about what you don't like about our episodes. We're always excited to hear from anybody that wants to pitch in. And thanks for listening, and play great games.
Play great games!